They say that surviving cancer teaches you what really matters in life. But what they don't tell you is that sometimes the people closest to you reveal who they really are when they think you're at your weakest. I used to believe that family meant unconditional love and support through the darkest times. At 58, after fighting and beating breast cancer, I've learned that sometimes the greatest battle isn't with the disease itself, but with the people who see your scars and decide you're somehow less than you were before. That realization hit me like a cold slap across the face on an ordinary Tuesday evening in my Austin home, when my daughter-in-law Jessica looked me straight in the eye and told me I wasn't whole anymore. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The comment came during what should have been a peaceful family dinner. I had spent the afternoon preparing Mark's favorite chicken enchiladas, the recipe my late husband David always said could cure any bad day. The kitchen smelled like cumin and comfort, and for a moment, I felt like the mother and grandmother I had always been. 8-year-old Emma was chattering about her school art project, her little hands gesturing wildly as she described the butterfly she was painting. Mark was scrolling through his phone between bites, typical of his generation, while Jessica sat rigid in her chair, filming herself eating with that practiced smile she reserved for her social media content. Jessica Patterson was what people politely called an influencer, though what exactly she influenced besides her own bank account was beyond me. She had built a modest following, posting about wellness, family life, and what she called authentic living from our kitchen and living room. The irony wasn't lost on me that someone preaching authenticity spent most of her time staging perfect moments for strangers on the internet. She was 32, blonde in that expensive way that required monthly maintenance, and possessed the kind of confidence that comes from never having faced real adversity. Her biggest crisis before marrying my son had been choosing between 2 job offers at local spas. That evening she was particularly focused on her phone, angling it to capture the golden hour light streaming through our floor-to-ceiling window. Our house in Westlake Hills had been featured in several of her posts over the past 2 years, though she always carefully cropped out any signs of my presence. I had noticed this pattern but never said anything, chalking it up to her particular aesthetic preferences. Looking back, I should have recognized it as the first red flag in a field full of them. "This lighting is absolutely perfect," Jessica murmured, adjusting her phone for the 10th time. "The engagement on family dinner content is always so much higher than my wellness posts." She paused, studying the screen with the intensity of a scientist examining a specimen. "Though I really need to figure out how to keep the frame tight on just our little family unit. The brand partnerships are specifically looking for that nuclear family vibe." "You know," Emma looked up from her enchilada, confused. "What about Grandma? Isn't she part of our family?" The silence that followed was the kind that makes your skin crawl. Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat, suddenly very interested in his food. Jessica's smile faltered for just a moment before snapping back into place with practiced precision. But there was something cold in her eyes now, something calculating that made my stomach clench with dread. "Well, sweetheart," Jessica said, reaching over to smooth Emma's hair with one hand while keeping her phone steady with the other. "Grandma is family, of course, but sometimes for Mommy's work, we need to show just the 3 of us. You understand, right? It's about telling the right story." Emma nodded, though I could see she didn't really understand at all. Children rarely do when adults start bending the truth into pretzel shapes, but I understood perfectly. I had been edited out of Jessica's perfect life narrative, trimmed away like an unwanted background element in her carefully curated world. "The right story," I repeated slowly, setting down my fork. "What exactly is wrong with the story that includes me?" Jessica's laugh was bright and sharp like broken glass catching sunlight. "Oh, Linda, don't take it personally. It's just business. Brands want aspirational content, and family wellness accounts need to project vitality and wholeness. After everything you've been through with the cancer and surgery and all that, it's just not the image that resonates with my audience demographic." The words hit me like a physical blow. "After everything you've been through, the cancer and surgery and all that," as if my mastectomy and reconstruction were merely inconvenient plot points in her social media strategy. as if the year I spent fighting for my life was nothing more than a dent in her content calendar. Mark finally looked up from his phone, his face flushed with embarrassment. Jess, maybe that's not the best way to put it. What? Jessica's voice climbed an octave, that particular tone she used when she felt criticized. I'm just being honest. Linda's been through a lot, and it shows. The mastectomy, the reconstruction, all those doctor visits. She's just not the same as she was before, and that's fine, it's totally understandable. But it doesn't fit the brand image I've worked so hard to build. She turned to me then, her expression softening into what she probably thought was compassion, but looked more like pity. You understand, don't you? After what you've been through, you're just not whole anymore. And my followers really respond to content that makes them feel good about themselves and their own families. Not whole anymore. The phrase echoed in my head like a bell tolling. Not whole anymore. As if losing a breast to save my life had somehow diminished my worth as a human being. As if the scars that marked my survival were shameful secrets to be hidden, rather than badges of courage to be honored. I looked around the table at my family. Emma was staring at her plate, clearly uncomfortable with the tension she didn't fully understand. Mark was still avoiding eye contact, his jaw working like he was chewing words he couldn't quite spit out. And Jessica sat there with that satisfied smile, convinced she had delivered an uncomfortable truth with appropriate gentleness, completely oblivious to the devastation she had just unleashed. This was my house. These walls had witnessed my late husband's laughter, my son's first steps, countless family celebrations and quiet moments of contentment. I had bought this property 22 years ago with money I earned from my pharmaceutical sales career, back when Austin was still quirky and affordable rather than the tech boomtown it had become. The mortgage had been paid off for 8 years now, and every square foot of it belonged to me. Yet somehow, I had become the outsider in my own home. Somehow, my cancer diagnosis and subsequent treatment had transformed me from the matriarch of this family into an embarrassing relative to be hidden from public view. Somehow, my survival had become my failure. The irony was almost laughable. Jessica worried about projecting wholeness and vitality while sitting in a house she could never afford, eating food she hadn't prepared, surrounded by furnishings and artwork I had carefully chosen and paid for over the decade. She spoke of authenticity while living a completely artificial life, dependent on the generosity of the woman she had just declared damaged goods. I thought about the past 2 years since Mark and Jessica had moved in with me. It had started as a temporary arrangement, after David's sudden heart attack. Mark had been worried about me living alone so soon after my cancer treatment, and I had welcomed the company. The house felt too quiet without David's presence, and having my son and his family there had felt like a blessing during those dark months of grief and recovery. But temporary had somehow become permanent. Their belongings had gradually spread throughout the house like an invasive species. Jessica's ring lights and camera equipment had taken over the guest bedroom. Mark's golf clubs filled the garage. Emma's toys were scattered through every room, which I didn't mind, but somehow I had become the babysitter rather than the grandmother. I cooked their meals, cleaned their messes, and watched Emma after school while they pursued their careers. I had never asked for rent or utilities or even groceries. The arrangement had simply evolved, and I had been too grateful for the company to question it. Now I was questioning everything. I had spent my entire adult life building financial security. My career in pharmaceutical sales had been demanding but lucrative, especially during the boom years when new drugs were launching monthly and territories were expanding rapidly. I had started as a territory rep, calling on doctors' offices, and had worked my way up to regional manager, overseeing a team of 12 salespeople across Central Texas. David had been proud of my success, often joking that I could sell ice to Eskimos and aspirin to pharmacists. Together we had made smart investments and careful financial decisions. We had bought this house when Westlake Hills was still considered the outskirts of Austin, watching our equity grow as the city expanded around us. We had maxed out our retirement contributions every year, diversified our portfolio, and paid off our mortgage early. When David died, his life insurance had added another $200,000 to my already substantial nest egg. The downtown condo I owned free and clear brought in $4,500 a month in rental income. My pension from the pharmaceutical company provided another $2,800 monthly. My investment portfolio, conservatively managed, generated enough dividends to cover most of my living expenses. I was, by any reasonable measure, financially independent and comfortable. Yet somehow I had allowed myself to become the invisible woman in my own home, the embarrassing secret in my own family. Jessica was still talking, explaining her content strategy and audience engagement metrics, as if I had asked for a business presentation. Mark was nodding along, offering occasional suggestions about camera angles and lighting. Emma had finished her dinner and was fidgeting in her chair, waiting for permission to be excused. The conversation flowed around me as if I weren't there, which I supposed was exactly how Jessica preferred it. I studied my daughter-in-law's face as she spoke. She was undeniably pretty, with the kind of polished appearance that came from regular salon visits and expensive skincare routine. Her highlight was perfect, her eyebrows professionally shaped, her teeth straight and white from years of orthodontics. Her parents had somehow afforded, despite their modest means. Everything about her was curated and controlled, designed to project success and happiness to an audience of strangers who followed her for lifestyle inspiration. But there was something brittle underneath all that polish, a desperation in the way she constantly checked her phone for likes and comments, an edge to her voice when she talked about other influencers who had more followers or better brand partnership, a calculation in the way she evaluated every moment for its content potential, unable to simply exist without documenting and monetizing the experience. She had never worked a traditional job for more than 6 months. Her longest employment had been at a local wellness spa, where she had lasted 8 months before deciding that hourly wages were beneath her potential. She had convinced Mark that her social media presence was a business investment, that the money they spent on her equipment and styling would pay off once she reached a certain threshold of followers. That threshold kept moving as the months passed and the brand partnerships remained modest. Mark, bless his heart, believed in her completely. He had always been trusting to a fault, seeing the best in people even when evidence suggested otherwise. As a child, he had befriended every stray animal and underdog classmate. His generous heart, sometimes leading him into situations that required parental intervention. That same generous heart had made him an easy target for Jessica's ambition. He made decent money in his marketing position at a local tech company, but not enough to support Jessica's lifestyle aspirations on its own. Their credit card debt had been growing steadily since their marriage, funding photography equipment, designer clothing for content creation, and the endless small luxuries that Jessica considered necessary for her brand. They had been renting an expensive apartment in downtown Austin before moving in with me, struggling to keep up with payments while maintaining the appearance of success. Living in my house had allowed them to redirect their rent money toward Jessica's business expenses and lifestyle maintenance. They could afford the salon visits, the designer handbags that appeared in her posts, the organic groceries and expensive supplements that filled our kitchen, all while I quietly paid the property taxes, homeowners insurance, utilities and maintenance costs for the house that provided the backdrop for their prosperity performance. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Not the hot, explosive anger that demands immediate action, but the cold, calculating kind that settles in your bones and sharpens your focus. Jessica saw me as damaged goods, but she had no problem living in my house, eating my food, and using my property as a prop for her artificial lifestyle. She wanted to erase me from her perfect family narrative while depending entirely on my generosity for her comfort and security. The hypocrisy was staggering. Here was a woman who preached authenticity while living a completely fabricated life, who spoke of wholeness while being fundamentally broken inside, who projected prosperity while being financially dependent on the woman she had just declared incomplete. I looked around the dining room table one more time, taking in the scene with new eyes. Emma, innocent and sweet, caught between adult tensions she couldn't understand. Mark, weak and complicit, choosing his wife's comfort over his mother's dignity. Jessica, cruel and calculating, convinced of her own righteousness while displaying behavior that would shame a stranger. Something shifted inside me at that moment. A door closed on the woman I had been, and another opened on the woman I was about to become. I had survived cancer, built a career, raised a son, and accumulated enough wealth to live comfortably for the rest of my life. I had fought battles these people couldn't imagine, and emerged victorious from challenges that would have broken weaker souls. If Jessica thought I wasn't whole anymore, she was about to discover just how complete my ability to change their lives really was. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. 3 faces turned toward me with varying expressions of curiosity, concern, and annoyance. I picked up my plate and silverware, moving toward the kitchen with deliberate calm. "Linda?" Mark's voice followed me, uncertain and slightly worried. "Everything okay?" I turned back to face them, my hand resting on the doorframe between the dining room and kitchen. The golden hour light Jessica had been so excited about was fading now, casting long shadows across the table where my family sat. In a few more minutes, it would be too dark for her perfect content, and she would have to find something else to occupy her attention. "I'm fine," I said, my voice steady and clear. "Just fine. I think I'll skip dessert tonight. You all enjoy the rest of your evening." I left them sitting there and walked into the kitchen, placing my dishes in the sink with careful precision. Through the window above the counter, I could see the lights of downtown Austin beginning to twinkle in the distance. My downtown condo was somewhere in that maze of buildings, sitting empty except for my tenants, who paid their rent reliably every month, $4,500 a month. Enough to live comfortably in any number of places where daughters-in-law didn't get to decide who was whole and who wasn't. Enough to start over, if starting over was what the situation required. I listened to the murmur of conversation from the dining room, Jessica's voice rising as she explained something to Mark with animated gesture. Emma's giggle echoed through the house, followed by the sound of chairs being pushed back from the table. Normal family sounds in what had been my normal family home. But normal, I was beginning to understand, was about to change dramatically. The question wasn't whether I was whole anymore. The question was whether I was strong enough to show them exactly how complete I really was. And after 35 years of building financial independence, surviving cancer, and raising a family, I was beginning to think the answer was yes. They had made their choice about my value and my place in their lives. Now it was time for me to make some choices of my own. And unlike Jessica's carefully staged content, my choices were going to be completely authentic, totally unfiltered, and absolutely fine. The next morning, I woke before dawn as I had every day since my chemotherapy treatments began 3 years ago. Old habits die hard, and the rhythm of early rising had become a comfort rather than a burden. The house was still quiet, wrapped in that peaceful silence that comes just before the world starts moving. I made my coffee in the kitchen, where Jessica had declared me incomplete the night before, letting the familiar ritual ground me as I planned my day. I had barely slept, but not from distress. Instead, my mind had been working methodically through the reality of my situation, like an accountant reviewing ledgers for discrepancies. What I found wasn't pretty, but it was illuminating. For 2 years I had been subsidizing the very people who now viewed me as damaged goods, unworthy of inclusion in their perfect family narrative. The numbers told a story that would make any financial advisor cringe. My property taxes alone were $11,000 annually. Homeowners insurance added another $2,800. Utilities ran about $400 monthly, higher in summer when the Austin heat demanded constant air conditioning. Maintenance and repairs averaged $1,500 a month when you factored in everything from lawn care to the new roof I'd installed last spring. Food expenses had tripled since they moved in, with Jessica's preference for organic everything, and Mark's newfound interest in craft beer adding substantial cost to every grocery trip. Conservative estimate, I was spending over $60,000 annually, to house and feed people who had just told me I wasn't whole enough to appear in their social media posts. $60,000 that could be funding my own interests, my own travels, my own version of the good life. Instead, it was financing Jessica's lifestyle brand and Mark's comfortable avoidance of adult financial responsibility. The coffee was strong and bitter, exactly how David used to make it before his heart attack changed everything. I stood at the kitchen window watching the sunrise paint the Texas sky in shades of orange and pink, colors that reminded me of the desert landscapes I'd always wanted to visit, but never found time for during my working years. New Mexico, Arizona, maybe even a trip to Santa Fe to see the art galleries and adobe architecture I'd read about in travel magazines. That was another revelation from my sleepless night. For someone supposedly incomplete, I had an awful lot of unfulfilled dreams and plans. The cancer diagnosis had forced me to confront my mortality, but surviving it had given me a strange gift, the absolute certainty that life was too short to waste on people who didn't value your presence. Jessica thought I wasn't whole, but sitting in my kitchen that morning, I felt more complete than I had in years. The sound of footsteps on the stairs interrupted my thoughts. Mark appeared in the doorway, hair messy and eyes heavy with sleep. He'd always been an early riser as a child, but marriage to Jessica had shifted his schedule to accommodate her late-night content creation sessions and leisurely morning routine. "Morning, Mom," he said, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone testing the temperature of a potentially volatile situation. "You're up early." "Same time as always," I replied, not turning from the window. "Your father and I were always early birds. Remember how he used to make pancakes on Saturday mornings before you even knew you were hungry?" Mark poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter, studying my profile with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "About last night," he began, then stopped as if unsure how to continue. "What about it?" Jessica didn't mean anything by what she said. "She's just really focused on her business right now, and sometimes she doesn't think before she speaks." I turned to face him then, this son I had raised to be honest and kind, watching him twist himself into knots, defending behavior that should have appalled him. "Doesn't think before she speaks, or thinks very carefully about what she wants to accomplish. That's not fair, isn't?" "Mark, your wife told me I'm not whole anymore because I survived cancer. She said I don't fit her brand image because my scars show that I fought for my life and won." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Which part of that sounds like thoughtless speaking rather than calculated cruelty? He flinched as if I'd slapped him, coffee mug frozen halfway to his lips. "She's under a lot of pressure with the business. The influencer market is really competitive, and she's trying to build something sustainable for our future." "Our future? What future is that, exactly?" "The one where you live in my house, rent-free, while she uses my property as a backdrop for content that explicitly excludes me. The one where I pay all the bills while she complains about my appearance affecting her engagement rates." Mark set down his mug with shaking hands. "We never asked you to pay for everything. You didn't have to ask. That's the beauty of your arrangement, isn't it? You just moved in and let me continue covering all the expenses while you redirect your income toward Jessica's equipment and lifestyle purchases. Very convenient." "It's not like that." "Then tell me what it's like, Mark. Explain to me how this arrangement benefits anyone other than you and your wife. Explain how watching Emma after school while you're both working, cooking dinner every night, maintaining a house that's become a content studio, and financing everyone's comfortable lifestyle is a fair exchange for being told I'm too damaged to appear in family photos." The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Mark stared into his coffee as if it contained answers he desperately needed, but couldn't find. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You could have said something sooner." When exactly should I have mentioned that I felt unwelcome in my own home? During one of Jessica's filming sessions, when I was shushed for making noise in my own kitchen, while she was rearranging my furniture to create better camera angle, or maybe when she started storing her ring lights and backdrop equipment in the guest bedroom I used to keep ready for when your Aunt Carol visits. Each word hit him like a physical blow, and I could see the recognition dawning in his eye. He was remembering incidents he'd dismissed or ignored, moments when his wife's behavior had crossed lines he'd chosen not to see. "I didn't realize," he said finally. "You didn't want to realize. There's a difference." Mark ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I remembered from his childhood, when he was wrestling with problems too big for his understanding. "What do you want us to do?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with possibilities he wasn't ready to consider. What did I want them to do? Move out? Apologize? Change their entire approach to our relationship? All of the above. I want you to think, Mark. Really think about the person you've become since you married Jessica. Think about whether you're proud of the man who stands by while his wife insults his mother's cancer survival. Think about whether this is the kind of husband and father you want to be. Before he could respond, Jessica's voice drifted down from upstairs, calling for him to help her set up a morning routine video. The sound cut through our conversation like a blade, reminding us both of where his priorities lay. Mark looked toward the stairs, then back at me, conflict written across his features. "She needs help with the lighting setup," he said apologetically. "Of course she does." He started toward the stairs, then paused at the doorway. "Mom, I do love you, you know that, right?" "I know you think you do, but love is more than words, Mark. It's about choices. It's about standing up for the people who matter when it costs you something to do it." He left me standing in the kitchen, the weight of unspoken truths settling around me like dust. Upstairs I could hear Jessica's animated voice giving direction for camera placement and angle adjustments. The business of being an influencer required constant attention, constant content creation, constant performance. No wonder she had no energy left for basic human decency. I finished my coffee and made a decision that felt both impulsive and inevitable. Today was Wednesday, which meant Dr. Williams had office hours at the cancer center, where I'd received my treatment. I hadn't seen her since my last follow-up appointment 6 months ago, but she had always told me to call if I needed anything, medical or otherwise. The drive to St. David's Medical Center took me through parts of Austin I rarely visited anymore. The city had changed so much since David and I first moved here in our 30s. What used to be quirky neighborhoods full of artists and musicians had been transformed into luxury developments and tech company campuses. The soul of the city was still there, if you knew where to look, but it required more effort to find it now. Dr. Sarah Williams had been my oncologist throughout my cancer journey, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and an unsentimental approach to difficult truth. She had guided me through diagnosis, treatment options, surgery, and recovery, with a combination of medical expertise and emotional intelligence that had made the impossible bearable. More than that, she had seen me at my absolute lowest and never once suggested that surviving cancer made me anything less than completely whole. Her office was exactly as I remembered it, warm, professional, filled with medical texts and family photos that reminded patients their doctor had a life beyond the examining room. She was between appointments when I arrived, and her face lit up with genuine pleasure when her nurse brought me back. "Linda, what a wonderful surprise. You look fantastic. How are you feeling?" "Physically, I'm excellent. Emotionally and mentally, that's a longer conversation." Williams gestured for me to sit in the comfortable chair across from her desk, the same chair where we'd discussed treatment options and prognosis during the darkest days of my diagnosis. "Tell me what's going on." I found myself telling her the living arrangement that had evolved from temporary support to permanent exploitation. Jessica's comments about my wholeness and worthiness for family photos, Mark's inability to defend me, or even recognize the problem. The financial burden I'd been carrying while being treated as an embarrassment by the very people benefiting from my generosity. Dr. Williams listened without interruption, her expression growing more serious as the story unfolded. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and was quiet for a long moment. "Linda, in all the years I've been treating cancer patients, I've seen families respond to diagnosis and treatment in every possible way. Some rise to the occasion and discover strength they never knew they had. Others crumble under pressure they can't handle, and some reveal who they really are when the crisis strips away all the polite pretenses. Which category does my family fall into? I think you already know the answer to that. The question is what you're going to do about it." We talked for another hour about practical matters and emotional realities. Dr. Williams reminded me of something I'd forgotten in the midst of my family drama. I was a cancer survivor. I had faced down a potentially terminal diagnosis, endured months of treatment that would have broken weaker people, and emerged victorious on the other side. If I could beat cancer, I could certainly handle a manipulative daughter-in-law and a spineless son. "You've been through hell, and came out stronger," she said as I prepared to leave. "Don't let anyone convince you that your scars are shameful. They're proof of your courage and resilience. Wear them with pride." Driving home, I felt something shifting inside me, like tectonic plates realigning after an earthquake. The woman who had walked into Dr. Williams' office was still processing the shock of Jessica's cruelty. The woman driving home was beginning to plan her response. I stopped at Radio Coffee on South First, a local institution that had somehow managed to survive Austin's transformation without losing its character. The afternoon crowd was typical for a Wednesday: freelancers with laptops, students with textbooks, retirees with newspapers, and young professionals grabbing caffeine between meetings. I ordered a lavender latte and found a table by the window where I could watch the foot traffic while I thought. Jessica wasn't wrong about one thing: the influencer market was competitive. Building a following required consistency, authenticity, and content that resonated with audience desire. Her mistake was thinking that authenticity meant excluding family members who didn't fit her aesthetic, rather than embracing the real complexity of life. But her superficial understanding of her own business presented an opportunity I was just beginning to recognize. Jessica's entire brand was built on the image of perfect family life in a beautiful home. Remove the beautiful home, and what did she have left? A young couple struggling financially while trying to maintain an expensive lifestyle they couldn't actually afford. The thought made me smile for the first time in 24 hours. Jessica wanted to edit me out of her perfect family story, but she'd forgotten that I owned the set where her performance took place. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through Jessica's social media accounts, something I'd avoided doing for months. Her Instagram showed exactly what I'd expected: carefully curated shots of our kitchen during golden hour, artfully arranged lifestyle products on our dining room table, Emma playing in our backyard, and Mark reading in our living room. Every image was tagged with aspirational captions about family life, wellness, and gratitude. The irony was almost too perfect. Her most recent post showed our kitchen counter styled with expensive organic products and fresh flowers, accompanied by a long caption about creating sacred spaces for nourishment and connection. The engagement was modest, but steady, with comments from followers asking about the sources for various items in the shot. Jessica had dutifully replied with affiliate links and discount codes, monetizing even the most mundane aspects of domestic life. My domestic life, to be precise. I scrolled back through months of content, documenting the ways Jessica had transformed my home into her commercial backdrop. The living room where David and I had spent countless evenings watching movies now appeared regularly as the setting for her morning routine videos. The garden I'd spent 15 years cultivating provided the backdrop for her wellness content. Even Emma's playroom, the space I'd decorated for my granddaughter's visits, had been repurposed as a prop for content about mindful parenting and creating calm spaces for children. Every square foot of my house had been commoditized and monetized by someone who now declared me too damaged to appear in the frame. Jessica had turned my home into her office, my belongings into her props, and my life into her content, all while maintaining that I was somehow insufficient for her brand. The audacity was breathtaking. I sat in that coffee shop for 2 hours, scrolling through Jessica's digital diary of entitlement and exploitation. By the time I finished my second latte, I had a complete understanding of how thoroughly my generosity had been abused. More importantly, I had the beginning of a plan that would address Jessica's concerns about brand authenticity in ways she never could have anticipated. If she wanted authentic content about family life, she was about to get more authenticity than she bargained for. If she believed that survival and resilience were incompatible with wholeness, she was about to learn exactly how complete a woman could be when she stopped allowing others to define her worth. The drive home took me past several apartment complexes and rental properties, and I found myself noticing for rent signs with new interest. Austin's rental market was notoriously expensive, especially for families who wanted to maintain the kind of lifestyle Jessica considered necessary for her brand. The nice places cost more than Mark's monthly salary, and the affordable options wouldn't provide the aesthetic backdrop Jessica required for her content. It was an interesting problem, the kind that would test their resourcefulness and priorities in ways they'd never had to consider while living in my house. I pulled into our driveway just as Emma was getting off the school bus, her backpack bouncing as she ran toward the front door. She waved at me with the unself-conscious enthusiasm that made grandchildren such a joy, completely unaware of the adult complications swirling around her young life. "Grandma, guess what we learned about in science today? Tell me everything," I said, meaning it completely. As we walked into the house together, Emma chattering about photosynthesis and plant life cycles, I realized that whatever came next, I needed to protect her from the fallout as much as possible. She was innocent in all of this, a child caught between adults who were about to face some very grown-up consequences for their choices. But protecting Emma didn't mean protecting her parents from the reality they'd created. In fact, it might mean exactly the opposite. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for people is to stop enabling their worst behaviors and force them to confront the truth about themselves. Jessica was upstairs when we entered, her voice carrying through the house as she recorded voiceover content for her latest video. Mark was still at work, safely removed from the tension that had filled our kitchen that morning. The house felt the same as always, but something fundamental had shifted in my perspective. This wasn't their house where I was an unwelcome guest. This was my house where they were temporary residents, whose lease on my generosity had just expired. Emma spread her homework across the kitchen table, the same table where Jessica had declared me incomplete less than 24 hours ago. As I helped my granddaughter with her math problems, I found myself calculating different kinds of numbers. Market rent for a house like this would run at least $4,500 monthly, property management fees, maintenance reserves and vacancy allowances would need to be factored in. But the downtown condo was generating steady income, and my other investments were performing well. I could absolutely afford to live anywhere I wanted while this house sat empty, or found new tenants who would appreciate both the space and the landlord. The math was actually quite simple, once you approached it with the right perspective. Jessica thought I wasn't whole enough for her family content, but my bank account was completely intact, and in a world where money talks louder than social media followers, that made all the difference. Emma finished her homework just as Jessica came downstairs, camera equipment in hand for what I assumed would be another kitchen scene. She stopped short when she saw us at the table, her expression flickering between annoyance and calculation. "Oh, you're back," she said to me, as if my presence in my own kitchen was unexpected. "I was hoping to get some content while the lighting is still good." "Don't let me stop you," I replied calmly. "Emma and I were just finishing up. Actually, could you maybe help Emma with her homework somewhere else? The kitchen setup took me an hour to get right, and I really need to film this while everything looks perfect." Emma looked between us with confusion, clearly not understanding why she couldn't do homework in the kitchen of her own home. But it wasn't her home, was it? It was mine, and I was finally ready to start acting like it. "No," I said simply. Jessica blinked, apparently stunned by the single syllable that had never passed between us before. "Excuse me," I said. "No, this is my kitchen table in my house, and my granddaughter is welcome to do her homework here whenever she likes. If that interferes with your content schedule, you'll need to work around it." The silence that followed was electric with tension. Jessica's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, clearly struggling to process this sudden shift in our dynamic. Emma continued working on her math problems, oblivious to the battle of wills happening above her head. "I don't understand," Jessica said finally. "You've never had a problem with my filming before. I've never been told I'm not whole enough to appear in your family content before either." Apparently, a lot of things are changing around here. Jessica's face flushed red, whether from embarrassment or anger, I couldn't tell. "That's not what I meant, and you know it, is it? Because what I heard was that my cancer survival makes me unsuitable for your brand image. What I heard was that my presence in this house, the house I own, doesn't fit your marketing strategy, so I'm adjusting my own strategy accordingly." "Linda, please don't blow this out of proportion." "I'm not blowing anything out of proportion. I'm simply responding to the information you've given me about my value in this household. If I'm not whole enough to be included in your perfect family narrative, perhaps it's time to create some authentic content about what happens when perfect families have to find their own housing." Jessica's equipment clattered to the floor as her hands began to shake. "You can't be serious." "I'm completely serious. In fact, I'm about as serious as a cancer diagnosis. And just like my cancer, this situation is going to require some very strategic thinking and decisive action." I stood up from the table,
helping Emma pack up her homework with the same calm efficiency I'd brought to every crisis in my 58 years. If Jessica wanted to see what incomplete looked like, she was about to discover that I was the most complete woman she'd ever underestimated. The battle lines had been drawn, and for the first time in 2 years I was ready to fight for my own home. That evening, after Emma was safely tucked into bed with her favorite stuffed elephant and a story about brave princesses who solved their own problems, I sat in my home office with a cup of chamomile tea and began making phone calls. The office had been David's sanctuary during his final years, filled with his medical journals and the financial documents we'd organized together during those precious months when we both knew time was running short. Now it felt like a command center where I could plan my strategic withdrawal from a situation that had become untenable. My first call was to Robert Chen, the estate planning attorney who had helped me navigate the legal complexities after David's death. Robert had been David's colleague during his brief stint working for a medical device company before returning to his cardiology practice, and their professional relationship had evolved into a genuine friendship over the years.
More importantly, Robert understood the financial landscape I was working with and had always given me honest, practical advice about protecting my assets. Linda, what a pleasant surprise. Robert's voice carried the warmth of someone who genuinely cared about his clients' well-being, beyond their billable hours. How are you feeling? Last time we talked, you were just finishing your reconstruction surgery. I'm feeling stronger than I have in years, actually, both physically and mentally. But I'm calling because I need some advice about property management and tenant rights. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that comes when an experienced attorney recognizes the significance of a seemingly simple question. Are you thinking about renting out the Westlake property? I'm thinking about a lot of things. Can you walk me through the legal requirements for establishing a landlord-tenant relationship in Texas? Specifically, what I would need to do if I wanted to formalize an arrangement with people who are currently living in my house without a lease agreement. Robert's voice shifted into professional mode, crisp and precise. Well, that depends on several factors. How long have they been residing in the property? Have they been paying rent or contributing to household expenses? Is there any written or verbal agreement about the terms of their occupancy? I explained the situation carefully, avoiding emotional language and sticking to the factual timeline of events. Mark and Jessica had moved in 2 years ago under the guise of temporary support during my grief and recovery. No rent had ever been discussed or paid. No formal agreement existed about the duration of their stay or their responsibility. They had gradually taken over more space and assumed permanent residence without any legal documentation. Interesting situation, Robert mused. Technically, they could be considered tenants at will, which means either party can terminate the arrangement with proper notice. In Texas, that's typically 30 days for month-to-month tenancy, though without a formal lease, the terms can be more flexible. And if I wanted to establish a formal lease agreement retroactively, you could certainly propose one, but both parties would need to agree to the term. If they refuse to sign or pay rent, you could begin eviction proceedings for non-payment. However, given the family relationship, I'd recommend trying to resolve this amicably first. What if amicable isn't possible? Another pause, longer this time. Linda, are you planning to ask them to move out? I'm planning to take control of my own property and my own life. Whatever that requires, I'm prepared to do. We spent another 40 minutes discussing the practical logistics of property management, eviction procedures, and the legal protections available to homeowners who needed to reclaim their space. Robert promised to email me the relevant documents and forms along with contact information for a property management company that specialized in high-end rentals if I decided to pursue that option. My second call was to Carol, my sister in Arizona, who had been watching my situation with growing concern for months. Carol was 3 years older than me and had never been shy about expressing her opinions, especially when she thought I was being taken advantage. As a retired nurse, she had developed a finely tuned sense for recognizing when people were being manipulated or exploited. I was wondering when you'd finally call, Carol said before I'd even finished my greeting. I've been waiting for you to wake up and smell the coffee about those two. You could have said something sooner. Would you have listened? You were so determined to help Mark through his grief and be the supportive mother-in-law that you couldn't see what was happening right in front of you. Sometimes people need to reach their own conclusion. Carol had met Jessica exactly twice, once at the wedding, and once during a brief visit to Austin, the previous Christmas. That had been enough for her to form a definitive opinion about my daughter-in-law's character and motivation. She'd made a few pointed comments during that visit that I'd dismissed as sisterly overprotectiveness, but now I was beginning to think Carol's nursing background had given her insights I'd been too polite to acknowledge. "So what's the plan?" Carol asked. "And please tell me you have one, because if you're calling me, that means you're finally ready to do something about this mess." I outlined my preliminary thinking about formalizing the living arrangement or asking them to move out entirely. Carol listened without interruption, occasionally making small sounds of approval or exasperation as the details unfolded. "About damn time," she said when I finished. "Linda, I love you dearly, but watching you turn into an unpaid housekeeper and bank account for those ungrateful people has been painful. You're a cancer survivor with financial independence and a beautiful life ahead of you. Stop wasting it on people who don't appreciate what you're offering. It's not that simple. There's Emma to consider, and Mark is still my son. Emma will be fine. Children are more resilient than adults give them credit for, and she'll benefit from seeing her grandmother stand up for herself. As for Mark, maybe it's time he learned to be a man instead of a boy who lets his wife make all the decisions. Some lessons hurt, but that doesn't mean they're not necessary." We talked for another hour about practical matters and emotional reality. Carol offered to come stay with me for a few weeks if I needed support during whatever transition was coming. She also reminded me of something I'd forgotten in the midst of family drama. I had a life beyond being Mark's mother and Emma's grandmother. I had interests, dreams, and possibilities that didn't revolve around accommodating other people's needs. "You know what I think you should do?" Carol said as we were ending the conversation. "I think you should take that trip to Santa Fe you've been talking about for 5 years. Get out of that house, clear your head, and let them figure out how to manage without you for a while. Might be educational for everyone involved." The idea struck me as both appealing and slightly terrifying. I hadn't traveled alone since David's death, partly because of my cancer treatment schedule and partly because I'd convinced myself that my family needed me. But Carol was right. A change of scenery might provide exactly the perspective I needed to make clear decisions about my future. After hanging up with Carol, I sat in David's chair and looked around the office we'd shared during our marriage. His presence was still strong here, in the careful organization of our financial records and the philosophical books he'd loved to read during quiet evenings. David had been a man of principle who believed in treating people with kindness, but never allowing himself to be diminished by others' selfishness. I could almost hear his voice urging me to stop accommodating behavior that would have appalled him. The next morning I woke with unusual energy and clarity of purpose. The house was quiet again, with Mark already gone to work and Jessica still asleep after what sounded like another late-night editing session. Emma had spent the night at a friend's house, which meant I had complete privacy to continue my planning without interruption. I made coffee and settled at the kitchen table with my laptop, pulling up the contact information Robert had emailed overnight. The property management company Austin Premier Rentals specialized in luxury homes and had an impressive portfolio of Westlake Hills properties similar to mine. Their website showed professional photographs of beautifully staged homes that commanded premium rental rates from corporate executives and relocated professionals who wanted upscale accommodation. The phone call with their leasing manager, a competent woman named Patricia, was both informative and encouraging. Properties like mine typically rented for between $4,500 and $5,500 monthly depending on furnishing and lease term. The company handled everything from tenant screening to maintenance coordination, taking a 12% management fee in exchange for complete service. Most importantly, they had a waiting list of qualified prospects looking for exactly the kind of property I own. "When were you thinking about making the property available?" Patricia asked. "I'm not sure yet. The current occupants don't have a formal lease, so I need to work through some family logistics first. I understand completely. Family situations can be delicate. When you're ready to move forward, we can have the property photographed and listed within a week. Based on the neighborhood and your description of the home's condition, I expect it would lease quickly." After that call, I spent 2 hours researching Santa Fe hotels and art galleries, planning the solo trip Carol had suggested. The idea of traveling alone had seemed daunting when she first mentioned it, but as I scrolled through images of Adobe architecture and desert landscapes, I felt a stirring of excitement I hadn't experienced in years. This could be more than just a vacation. It could be a declaration of independence, a statement that Linda Patterson was perfectly capable of creating her own adventure. I booked a 5-day stay at a boutique hotel near the plaza, complete with art studio tours and a cooking class focused on Southwestern cuisine. The total cost was less than what I spent monthly subsidizing Mark and Jessica's lifestyle, which put the financial priorities into stark perspective. Jessica emerged from her bedroom around noon, looking perfectly put together despite her late night. She moved through the kitchen with purposeful efficiency, gathering props for what I assumed would be another lifestyle content session. Her movements were careful and deliberate, designed to avoid any interaction that might lead to a repeat of our previous evening's confrontation. "Good morning," I said pleasantly, not looking up from my laptop. "Morning," she replied curtly, clearly hoping to minimize conversation. "I wanted to let you know that I'll be traveling to Santa Fe next week, Monday through Friday." Jessica paused in her arrangement of artisanal honey jars and organic granola packages, her expression shifting from wariness to interest. "Oh, vacation? Art galleries and personal time. I thought it might be good to get away for a few days." "That sounds nice," Jessica said, though her tone suggested she was calculating the implications rather than expressing genuine happiness for my plans. "Will you need us to do anything while you're gone? House sitting or anything?" The question revealed so much about her mindset. She automatically assumed that my leaving would require them to take on additional responsibilities, as if the house couldn't function without constant oversight. It never occurred to her that they were the guests whose presence required accommodation, not the residents whose absence would create problems. "The house will be fine," I said. "I've arranged for the lawn service to come on Wednesday and Mrs. Rodriguez next door will collect any package. Everything else can wait until I get back." "What about Emma's after-school care? Don't you usually pick her up on Tuesdays and Thursdays?" Another revealing question. Jessica had become so accustomed to my unpaid childcare services that she'd forgotten they were a favor, not an obligation. The assumption that my travel plans should revolve around their convenience was both stunning and illuminating. "You'll need to arrange alternative care for those days, perhaps the after-school program at her school, or maybe Mark could adjust his schedule." Jessica's mouth opened and closed without sound, clearly struggling to process this unexpected disruption to their routine. "But we've never used the after-school program. Emma's not enrolled. Then you'll need to enroll her or find another solution. I'm sure you'll figure something out." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken frustration. Jessica continued arranging her props, but her movements had become sharp and aggressive, betraying her emotional state, despite her attempt to maintain composure. "This seems pretty sudden," she said finally. "You've never mentioned wanting to travel before. I've never had to ask permission to leave my own house before either. Apparently a lot of things are changing." Jessica's careful facade cracked slightly, revealing the annoyance underneath. "Look, if this is about what I said the other night, I think you're overreacting. I was just trying to explain the business considerations behind my content strategy. It wasn't personal. Telling someone they're not whole anymore because they survived cancer is always personal. Just the fact that you can't understand that says more about you than it does about me. I never said you weren't whole. I said you didn't fit the brand image I'm trying to create. There's a difference, is there? Because from where I'm sitting it sounds like you're splitting hairs to avoid acknowledging that you were cruel and hurtful to someone who has done nothing but support you." Jessica's composure finally shattered completely. "Support me? You mean judge me? You think I don't know what you really think about my career and my choices? You think I don't see the way you look at me when I'm working, like what I do isn't real or valuable?" The accusation hung in the air between us, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Jessica's defensiveness revealed an insecurity I hadn't fully recognized, a desperate need for validation that manifested as aggression when she felt threatened. But understanding her psychology didn't excuse her behavior or obligate me to continue enabling it. "I've never judged your career choices, Jessica. I've questioned your approach to family relationships and your apparent belief that my house exists for your convenience.
but I've never criticized your professional aspirations. You don't have to say it out loud. I can tell what you're thinking. What I'm thinking is that you've built a business that depends entirely on my generosity while treating me like an inconvenience in my own home. What I'm thinking is that you've confused my kindness with weakness, and my accommodation with obligation. What I'm thinking is that it's time for that to change. Jessica's face flushed red, whether from embarrassment or anger, I couldn't determine. So what? You're going to kick us out because I hurt your feelings. I'm going to reclaim my home and my life because I deserve better than being treated as a second-class citizen in my own house. Your feelings about that are your responsibility, not mine. The conversation ended when Mark's car pulled into the driveway, interrupting what had clearly been building toward a more explosive confrontation. Jessica immediately shifted into performance mode, rearranging her expression and body language to project calm competence rather than the frustration that had been radiating from her moments before. Mark entered through the kitchen door with the weary expression of someone who had spent the day anticipating difficult conversations. His eyes darted between Jessica and me, clearly trying to assess the emotional temperature of the room. "Everything okay here?" he asked with forced casualness. "Your mother is going to Santa Fe next week," Jessica announced, as if this was breaking news rather than information I'd shared an hour earlier. "That's great, Mom," Mark said, though his tone suggested uncertainty about whether it actually was great. "You've been wanting to see those art galleries for years." "I have. It seemed like the perfect time to finally make it happen." "What about Emma's after-school care?" Jessica interjected. "Linda usually picks her up on Tuesdays and Thursdays." Mark looked confused. "Can't you get her?" "Your schedule is more flexible than mine. I have client calls those afternoons, and the after-school pickup line takes forever. It would completely mess up my content schedule." The exchange provided a perfect window into their relationship dynamics and priority. Jessica's business schedule took precedence over childcare responsibilities, and Mark automatically assumed I would continue providing free services regardless of my own plans. Neither of them seemed to consider that my availability was a courtesy, not a commitment. "You'll figure something out," I said calmly. "Parents manage these logistics every day, but we've never had to," Jessica protested. "You've always been available, and I've been happy to help when I could, but I'm not available next week, so you'll need alternative arrangements." Mark's expression shifted as the implications began to register. "Is everything okay, Mom? This feels like more than just a vacation." The question was loaded with subtext and concern, but also with the assumption that my decisions should be transparent to him regardless of how his choices affected me. For 2 years he had lived in my house without considering how his presence impacted my life. Now he was struggling to understand why I might need space and independence. "Everything is fine. I simply decided it was time to prioritize my own interests for a change." "Your own interests?" "Travel, art, experiences that don't revolve around other people's needs, and schedule." It's remarkable how many possibilities open up when you stop defining yourself exclusively as someone's mother or grandmother. The silence that followed was uncomfortable for everyone except me. I had spoken a truth that challenged the family dynamics we'd all accepted without question, and none of us were quite sure how to navigate the new territory. Jessica was the first to break the tension, gathering her props with sharp, efficient movement. "I need to finish this content while the lighting is still good. We can discuss childcare logistics later." She disappeared upstairs with her equipment, leaving Mark and me alone in the kitchen where this whole mess had started. He sat heavily in the chair across from me, running his hands through his hair in the gesture I remembered from his childhood. "Mom, what's really going on? Yesterday you seemed upset about Jessica's comments, and now you're making travel plans and talking about prioritizing your own interests. It feels like something fundamental has changed." He wasn't wrong. Something fundamental had changed, but it wasn't something that had happened overnight. It was the culmination of 2 years of small compromises and overlooked boundaries that had gradually eroded my sense of ownership in my own life. "What's going on is that I'm remembering who I was before I became your unpaid housekeeper and childcare provider. I'm remembering that I have agency and choices that don't require anyone else's approval." "Is this about money? Because if you need us to start contributing more to household expenses, we can work something out." The offer was both touching and insulting.
Touching because it suggested he was beginning to recognize the financial imbalance in our arrangement. Insulting because it framed my independence as a problem to be solved with a payment plan rather than a legitimate desire for autonomy. This isn't about money, Mark. This is about respect and boundaries and remembering that I'm a complete person with my own needs and desires. Your wife made it very clear that she doesn't consider me worthy of inclusion in your family narrative. I'm simply adjusting my own narrative accordingly. She didn't mean it that way. How did she mean it then? Explain to me how telling someone they're not whole anymore because they survived cancer could possibly be interpreted as anything other than cruel and hurtful. Mark had no answer for that, because there wasn't one. Instead, he sat in uncomfortable silence while I finished my coffee and closed my laptop. The afternoon was beautiful, warm but not yet oppressively hot, and I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood I'd called home for more than 2 decades. The walk gave me time to think about what I really wanted from the situation. Was I looking for an apology from Jessica? A change in behavior from Mark? A complete reset of our living arrangement? Or was I simply done with the whole dynamic and ready to move forward independently? By the time I returned to the house an hour later, I had my answer. I wasn't interested in managing other people's feelings or negotiating compromises that would inevitably favor their comfort over my autonomy. I was ready to reclaim my space and my life, regardless of how that decision affected their plans. The house was quiet when I walked in, with Jessica presumably still working upstairs and Mark likely hiding in their bedroom to avoid further difficult conversation. Emma would be home from her friend's house soon, and I wanted to spend quality time with her before beginning the process of disentangling myself from the role of full-time grandmother and household manager. I sat in David's office and opened my laptop again, pulling up the travel confirmation for Santa Fe and the property management information Robert had provided. The pieces of my exit strategy were falling into place with surprising ease, as if the universe was finally aligning to support a decision I should have made months ago. My phone buzzed with a text from Carol. "How did the family conversations go today?" I typed back, "Still in progress, but I'm making Santa Fe reservations for next week." Her response was immediate. "Proud of you. It's about time you remembered that you're the star of your own story, not a supporting character in theirs." She was right, of course. For 2 years I had allowed myself to become a background player in my own life, facilitating other people's dreams while putting my own on hold. Jessica's cruel comment had been a wake-up call, but the real problem was much deeper than one thoughtless moment. The real problem was that I had forgotten my own worth in my eagerness to be helpful and accommodating. I had confused being needed with being valued, and had allowed other people's convenience to take precedence over my own well-being. That was going to change, starting immediately. Jessica thought I wasn't whole anymore, but she was about to discover that I was the most complete woman she'd ever underestimated. And unlike her carefully staged content, my next moves were going to be entirely authentic and absolutely unstoppable. The weekend before my Santa Fe trip unfolded like a carefully orchestrated symphony of passive-aggressive tension and desperate manipulation. Jessica had clearly spent considerable time strategizing her response to my newfound independence, and her campaign began Saturday morning with an elaborate breakfast production in my kitchen. She'd arranged fresh flowers, expensive pastries from a local bakery, and what appeared to be every piece of photogenic dishware I owned into a tableau that screamed perfect family weekend. Emma was enlisted as an unwitting co-star, dressed in a coordinated outfit that matched Jessica's carefully selected athleisure ensemble. The whole scene was designed to project harmony and gratitude, with Jessica's phone positioned at multiple angles to capture what she kept referring to as authentic family moments. The irony wasn't lost on me that her idea of authenticity required more staging than a Broadway production. "Linda, come sit with us," Jessica called out with saccharine sweetness as I entered the kitchen for my morning coffee. "I want to get some shots of all of us together. I've been thinking about what you said about inclusion, and I realized I haven't been featuring you enough in my content." The sudden reversal was so transparent it was almost insulting. After 2 years of careful exclusion and a week of awkward tension, Jessica was now desperate to demonstrate her commitment to family unity. She'd even prepared talking points about multi-generational living and the wisdom of elders, complete with hashtags about gratitude and authentic relationships. "I'm not interested in being your content," I said simply, pouring my coffee and moving toward the patio door. "But you're welcome to continue your production without me." "Please, Linda, I think I gave you the wrong impression about my feelings. You're such an important part of our family, and I want my followers to see that. I've been selfish about my content strategy, and I want to make it right. Emma looked up from her elaborate breakfast setup with confusion, clearly written across her 8-year-old features. Grandma, why don't you want to be in the pictures? You're always in our family photo. The innocent question hit exactly where Jessica had intended it to. Using my granddaughter's natural desire for inclusion as emotional leverage, it was a masterful manipulation, targeting my love for Emma while simultaneously positioning Jessica as the generous party extending an olive branch. Your grandmother is being a little sensitive right now, Jessica said with practiced concern. Sometimes adults have hurt feelings about silly things, but we work through them together as a family. The gaslighting was breathtaking in its audacity. Jessica was rewriting the entire narrative of our conflict, transforming her cruel comment about my wholeness into my sensitivity about silly things. She was counting on my desire to maintain peace in front of Emma, to force my compliance with her performance. Emma's sweetheart, why don't you go get your art supplies? I'd love to see what you're working on for your school project. Emma brightened immediately, abandoning her staged breakfast to retrieve her butterfly painting from the living room. As soon as she was out of earshot, Jessica dropped the saccharine tone and revealed the steel underneath. Look, I know you're upset about what happened this week, but we need to figure out how to move forward. Mark is stressed about this tension between us, and it's affecting Emma too. Can't we just put this behind us and go back to how things were? How things were involved you treating me like an unwelcome guest in my own home, while using my property as a backdrop for your business. I'm not interested in returning to that dynamic. Fine. Then what do you want? Do you want an apology? Do you want us to pay rent? Do you want me to feature you in my content? Just tell me what it will take to fix this. The transactional approach to our relationship was revealing. Jessica saw our conflict as a negotiation rather than a consequence of her behavior. She was willing to make concessions to restore her comfortable situation, but she couldn't understand that some damage couldn't be repaired with bargaining. I want you to understand that I'm not a problem to be managed or a resource to be exploited. I'm a complete person with my own needs and desires, and those needs no longer include subsidizing your lifestyle while being treated as less than whole. But I never meant it that way. I was just trying to explain the business considerations behind my content decision. You're taking it way too personally. There's no impersonal way to tell someone they're not whole anymore because they survived cancer. That's a fundamentally personal attack, and the fact that you can't see that is exactly why we have a problem. Jessica's frustration was becoming visible despite her efforts to maintain composure. So what? You're going to punish our entire family because you misunderstood one comment. That seems pretty extreme. I'm not punishing anyone. I'm simply prioritizing my own well-being for the first time in 2 years. If that feels like punishment to you, perhaps you should examine why my independence threatens your comfort. The conversation was interrupted by Mark's appearance, looking like he'd been sent on a reconnaissance mission by his wife. He'd clearly been briefed on Jessica's peacemaking strategy, and his expression carried the hopeful uncertainty of someone who desperately wanted to believe that complex problems could be solved with simple solutions. Mom, Jessica tells me you two are working things out. That's great news. Jessica is attempting to manage a situation that has already moved beyond management. I'm not working anything out. I'm moving forward with my own plans. What plans? You mentioned the Santa Fe trip, but what else are you thinking about? The question was loaded with anxiety that he was trying to disguise as casual interest. Mark had spent the week watching his comfortable living situation destabilize, and he was clearly hoping for reassurance that his world wasn't about to change dramatically. I'm thinking about a lot of things: property management, downsizing, travel, maybe relocating somewhere with better weather for my joints. The possibilities are quite extensive when you're not tied down by other people's expectations. The words hit both of them like physical blows. Jessica's face went pale, and Mark's expression shifted from hopeful to panicked. The suggestion that I might not only establish boundaries but potentially leave Austin entirely was clearly outside the range of outcomes they'd considered. Relocating, Mark's voice cracked slightly. Mom, you've lived in this house for over 20 years. All your friends are here, your doctors, your support system. You can't seriously be thinking about moving. I can seriously think about whatever I want. That's the beauty of being financially independent and emotionally unencumbered. My choices are my own. But what about Emma? What about us? This is our home too, the possessive language was telling. Mark genuinely believed that his temporary residence in my house had evolved into permanent ownership right. He couldn't conceive of a scenario where his needs and preferences weren't the primary consideration in my decision-making process. This is my home, Mark. You've been guests here for 2 years, and guests don't get to dictate their host's life choices. If you've become too comfortable in that role, perhaps it's time to reconsider the arrangement. Jessica finally abandoned her conciliatory approach and revealed the desperation underneath. You can't just kick us out. We've been helping you, living here to support you through your recovery. We gave up our apartment to be here for you. You gave up your apartment because you couldn't afford the rent while maintaining your lifestyle. Living here has been financially beneficial to you, not sacrificial. Don't rewrite history to make yourself the victim. That's not fair. We've been contributing to the household. I cook dinner sometimes, and Mark does yard work. You cook dinner occasionally when it fits your content schedule, and Mark mows the lawn twice a month. Meanwhile, I pay the mortgage, insurance, utilities, property taxes, and most of the grocery. Your contributions are minimal compared to the value you receive. The mathematical reality was stark and undeniable. Jessica's occasional cooking and Mark's sporadic yard work were worth perhaps a few $100s monthly, while their residence in my house saved them thousands in rent alone. The disparity was so obvious that even they couldn't argue with the numbers. Fine, Jessica said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. If you want us to pay rent, we'll pay rent. How much do you want? I don't want you to pay rent. I want you to find your own place to live. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma had returned with her art supplies and was setting up at the kitchen table, oblivious to the adult drama unfolding around her. Her presence added another layer of complexity to the conversation, reminding all of us that our decisions would affect more than just the immediate participants. Mom, please, Mark said quietly, let's not do anything hasty. Maybe we can all take a step back and work through this more calmly. There's nothing hasty about this decision. I've been thinking about it for months, and Jessica's comment simply crystallized what I already knew. This arrangement isn't working for me anymore. What if we set up some ground rules, specific expectations about household contributions and personal space? We could formalize the arrangement so everyone knows what's expected. The only arrangement I'm interested in formalizing is your departure. I'm done being a landlord to people who don't respect me as a person. Jessica's composure finally cracked completely. This is insane. You're destroying our family over one stupid comment. Do you have any idea what this will do to Emma, to Mark, to all of us? I'm not destroying anything. I'm simply choosing to prioritize my own well-being over your comfort. If that destroys your family, then your family wasn't built on a very solid foundation. You're being selfish and cruel. We've been nothing but supportive and grateful. Supportive? You told me I wasn't whole anymore because I survived cancer. Grateful? You use my house as a business backdrop while excluding me from your family narrative. Your definition of supportive and grateful is very different from mine. The argument was escalating towards something that would definitely traumatize Emma, so I made the decision to remove myself from the situation entirely. I gathered my coffee and headed for the patio, leaving Mark and Jessica to process the new reality of their circumstance. The backyard had always been my sanctuary, a carefully cultivated space where I could garden and read and think without interruption. David and I had spent countless evenings here, planning our retirement and dreaming about the travels we'd take once his cardiology practice slowed down. Those dreams had died with him, but sitting in my garden that morning, I realized they didn't have to stay buried. I pulled out my phone and called Patricia at Austin Premier Rental. She answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the professional cheerfulness of someone who understood that Saturday calls usually meant serious business. Linda, how nice to hear from you. Have you made a decision about listing your property? I'm very close to a decision. Can you walk me through the timeline if I wanted to move forward quickly? Absolutely.
We could have a photographer out Monday or Tuesday for listing photos. Professional staging consultation on Wednesday if you want to optimize the presentation. Property could be live on our website by Thursday, and we typically see serious inquiries within the first week. And what about current occupants? I mentioned that I have family members living in the house without a formal lease. We can work with that. Texas law requires 30 days notice for month-to-month tenancies, but since there's no written agreement, you have more flexibility. We can coordinate the transition to ensure everything is handled legally and professionally. Perfect. I'll confirm Monday whether I want to proceed. Excellent. I'll send over the initial paperwork so you can review everything in advance. Properties in your neighborhood rarely stay on the market long, so I expect we'll have qualified tenants quickly. After hanging up, I sat in my garden for another hour, watching the morning light filter through the oak trees. David and I had planted shortly after moving into the house. The trees were mature now, providing shade and beauty that we'd only been able to imagine when they were saplings. There was something poetic about the timing of my decision. The garden David and I had created together was now mature enough to thrive without my constant attention, just as I was finally mature enough to prioritize my own growth. The sliding door opened and Emma appeared, carrying her art supplies and wearing the determined expression of a child on a mission. She settled beside me on the outdoor furniture and began arranging her paints with the same careful attention to detail that Jessica brought to her content creation. "Grandma, are you really going to make us move away?" The question was asked with the direct honesty that only children can manage, cutting straight to the heart of the matter without adult complications and justification. Emma had clearly overheard enough of our conversation to understand that major changes were coming, and she deserved an honest answer. "I'm not making anyone move, sweetheart.
I'm making some changes to my living situation that might affect where you and your parents live. But wherever you end up, I'll still be your grandmother, and I'll still love you just as much. But I like living here with you, we have fun together, and you help me with my homework, and you tell the best bedtime stories. I love spending time with you too, and none of that has to change just because you might live in a different house. We can still have homework time, and story time, and fun together." Emma considered this with the seriousness of a child trying to understand adult complexities. "Is it because Mommy said you weren't whole? Because that was mean, and I think she should apologize." The innocent observation hit me harder than any of Jessica's manipulative arguments. Emma had understood instinctively what her mother couldn't grasp, that words have power, and some words cause damage that can't be easily repaired. "Thank you for saying that, sweetheart. It was mean, and it did hurt my feelings, but this is about more than just one comment. Sometimes adults need to make big changes to take better care of themselves, like when you had to have surgery to take care of the cancer. Exactly like that. Sometimes taking care of yourself means doing things that are hard or scary, but they're necessary for your health and happiness." Emma nodded with the wisdom of a child who had watched her grandmother fight cancer and emerge stronger. She'd seen me make difficult decisions for my own well-being before, and she trusted that I knew what was best for myself. "Will you still come to my school plays and art shows? I wouldn't miss them for the world. And will you still teach me how to paint watercolors?" "Of course. In fact, maybe when you come visit my new place, we can set up a proper art studio where we can paint together without worrying about making a mess." The idea of a dedicated art space clearly appealed to Emma's creative sensibilities. She brightened considerably and began chattering about the kinds of paintings we could create together. Her resilience reminded me that children are far more adaptable than adults often assume, and that protecting her meant modeling healthy boundary setting rather than enabling dysfunctional family dynamics. We spent the rest of the morning painting together, creating watercolor landscapes that captured the beauty of the Texas Hill Country. Emma's butterfly painting was developing into something truly beautiful, with delicate wings that seemed to shimmer in the sunlight. As we worked, I realized that this was exactly the kind of authentic family moment Jessica had been trying to stage earlier. Organic, unforced, focused on genuine connection rather than social media presentation. The irony wasn't lost on me that the most meaningful family time was happening while Jessica was presumably upstairs crafting content about the importance of family relationships. Real connection couldn't be manufactured for an audience. It emerged naturally when people prioritized presence over performance. Mark appeared on the patio around noon, looking haggard and defeated. He'd clearly spent the morning in difficult conversations with Jessica, and his expression suggested those conversations hadn't gone well. "Mom, can we talk privately?" I looked at Emma, who was deeply absorbed in adding details to her butterfly's wing. "Emma, sweetheart, why don't you take your painting inside to dry? You can finish it later." After Emma gathered her supplies and headed into the house, Mark settled heavily in the chair across from me. His shoulders were slumped with the weight of someone who had finally realized that his comfortable situation was about to change dramatically. "Jessica is upstairs crying. She's convinced you hate her and want to destroy our family. She's talking about calling her parents, maybe moving back to their town in East Texas." "I don't hate Jessica. I simply refuse to continue enabling her behavior at my own expense. If she chooses to interpret that as hatred, that's her decision. But East Texas, Mom. There's nothing there for us, no opportunities, no connections, no future. It would be like starting over from scratch. People start over all the time, Mark. It's not the end of the world." "Easy for you to say. You have this house, your investments, your security. We have nothing without your support." The admission was both heartbreaking and infuriating. Mark had finally acknowledged the truth about their financial dependence, but he framed it as my responsibility rather than their problem to solve. He genuinely believed that his comfort was more important than my autonomy. "You have your education, your work experience, your health, and your family. That's more than many people have when they're starting over. You're 35 years old, Mark. It's time to build your own security instead of depending on mine. I never wanted to depend on you." This whole arrangement was supposed to be temporary, just until we got back on our feet after the wedding expenses and everything. The wedding was 3 years ago. "How long did you think temporary would last?" Mark had no answer for that, because he'd never thought about it at all. Temporary had become permanent through inertia and avoidance, not through any conscious decision. He'd been content to drift along in a comfortable situation without considering the cost to anyone else. What if we made some changes? What if Jessica apologized sincerely, and we established clear boundaries about her content creation? What if we started paying rent and taking on more household responsibilities? What if you'd done any of those things before I reached my breaking point? What if you'd defended me when your wife called me incomplete? What if you'd recognized that I was subsidizing your lifestyle while being treated as an inconvenience? I should have. I know I should have. I was trying to keep the peace and I ended up making everything worse. You ended up choosing your wife's comfort over your mother's dignity. That's a choice with consequences, Mark. You can't undo it with belated recognition." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of Jessica's voice from the kitchen, raised and agitated as she spoke on the phone. Her words were muffled by distance and walls, but her tone was clearly distressed. Mark's expression shifted from resignation to alarm as he recognized the escalation in her emotional state. "I should go check on her. She's been making calls all morning. Probably trying to figure out backup plans. That's probably why. The sooner you both accept that this situation is changing, the sooner you can make productive plans for your future." Mark stood slowly, looking older than his 35 years. "Mom, I want you to know that I'm grateful for everything you've done for us. I know I haven't shown it properly, and I know I've let you down, but I do love you, and I'm sorry it took this crisis for me to realize how badly I've handled everything. I love you too, Mark. That's why I'm doing this." Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop enabling someone's poor choices and force them to grow up. After Mark went inside, I remained on the patio for another hour, listening to the sounds of agitated conversation and frantic phone calls filtering through the house. Jessica was clearly in full crisis mode, reaching out to her network for support and alternative living arrangements. The reality of their situation was finally sinking in, and the panic was setting in accordingly. By evening, the house felt like a war zone. Jessica had spent the day oscillating between tears and anger, making increasingly desperate phone calls to friends and family members who might be able to offer temporary housing or financial assistance. Mark had retreated into himself, mechanically going through the motions of normal weekend activities, while clearly struggling to process the magnitude of their situation. Emma sensed the tension and had become clingy and anxious, requiring extra attention and reassurance that the adult conflicts weren't her fault. I spent the evening focused on her needs, reading stories and playing quiet games that would help her feel secure despite the chaos swirling around her. As I tucked Emma into bed that night, she asked the question that had been weighing on her all day. "Grandma, will everything be okay?" "Everything will be okay, sweetheart. It might be different than it is now, but different doesn't mean bad. Sometimes changes that seem scary at first turn out to be exactly what we needed, like when you had to have surgery to get better. Exactly like that. Sometimes taking care of yourself means making hard choices. But they're the right choices for your health and happiness." Emma nodded and snuggled deeper into her blankets. "I love you, Grandma. I love you too, sweetheart. Always and forever. No matter what." After Emma was asleep, I sat in David's office and finalized my travel arrangements for Santa Fe. The trip had evolved from a simple getaway into a strategic retreat, giving me space to think clearly while allowing Mark and Jessica to process their new reality without my presence complicating their emotions. I also sent a brief email to Patricia at Austin Premier Rentals, confirming that I wanted to move forward with listing the property. The decision felt both momentous and inevitable, like stepping off a cliff that I'd been approaching for months without realizing it. The die was cast. By the time I returned from Santa Fe, my house would be on the rental market, and Mark and Jessica would need to have concrete plans for their future. The comfortable limbo we'd all been living in was about to end, and everyone would need to adapt to a new reality. For the first time in years, I felt genuinely excited about the future. Jessica thought I wasn't whole anymore, but I was about to demonstrate just how complete a woman could be when she finally decided to prioritize her own well-being. The next chapter of my life was about to begin, and I was the one writing it. When I returned from Santa Fe 5 days later, everything had changed. The house felt different the moment I walked through the front door, lighter somehow, as if a heavy blanket had been lifted from the atmosphere. The oppressive tension that had dominated our home for weeks was gone, replaced by an almost eerie calm that suggested major decisions had been made in my absence. The first thing I noticed was the absence of Jessica's ring lights and photography equipment from the living room. The second was the neat stack of boxes in the hallway, labeled in Mark's careful handwriting with destinations like Emma's room and master bedroom. They had clearly spent my absence preparing for the inevitable, and the evidence of their planning was both satisfying and slightly melancholy. Mark emerged from the kitchen as I set down my suitcase, his expression a complex mixture of resignation and relief. He looked like a man who had wrestled with a difficult decision and finally made peace with the outcome, though the shadows under his eyes suggested the process hadn't been easy. "Mom, welcome home. How was Santa Fe?" "Transformative," I said honestly. "The art galleries were incredible, and I met some fascinating people. I even signed up for a pottery class that starts next month." "That's wonderful, you look happy." "I am happy. More than I've been in years actually. And I can see you've been busy while I was gone." Mark gestured toward the boxes with a rueful smile. "We found a place, a rental house in South Austin, near Emma's school. It's not as nice as here, but it's ours, and we can afford it without depending on anyone else." The words carried a weight of acceptance that told me more than any lengthy explanation could have. Mark had finally understood that their comfortable arrangement was over, and rather than fighting the inevitable, he had chosen to embrace the challenge of genuine independence. "I'm proud of you," I said, meaning it completely. "That couldn't have been an easy decision." "It wasn't. But you were right about everything. We'd gotten too comfortable depending on your generosity, and somewhere along the way we forgot that this was your home, not ours." Jessica appeared at the top of the stairs, looking smaller somehow than when I'd left. The polished confidence that had defined her presence in my house was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like humility. She descended slowly, as if approaching a conversation she'd been dreading. "Linda, I owe you an apology. A real one, not the manipulative nonsense I tried before you left." I waited, curious to see if she could actually deliver the authentic accountability she'd never shown before. "I was cruel when I said you weren't whole anymore." "There's no excuse for that comment, and no justification for the way I treated you in your own home. You opened your house to us when we needed help,
and I repaid that kindness by making you feel unwelcome in your own space. The apology was more genuine than anything I'd heard from her before, though it came too late to change the fundamental dynamics between us. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt with words alone. I accept your apology, Jessica. I hope you'll remember this experience and treat the next person who helps you with more respect. I will, and I want you to know that I'm not moving back to East Texas. I found a job at a local marketing firm, doing social media management for small businesses. It's not glamorous, but it's honest work that pays actual money. The transformation was remarkable. Jessica had apparently spent my absence confronting the reality of her situation and making practical plans for genuine financial independence. The entitled influencer who had declared me incomplete was gone, replaced by someone who looked ready to take responsibility for her own future. That's excellent news. I'm sure you'll do well. Emma bounded down the stairs with the resilience that children display when adults finally stop creating drama around them. She launched herself into my arms with the enthusiasm of someone who had missed me terribly, but wasn't worried about the future. Grandma, I finished my butterfly painting, and Daddy says we're going to have our own house with a yard where I can plant flowers. That sounds wonderful, sweetheart, and I have something special for you from Santa Fe. I retrieved the handmade wooden paintbrush set I'd found in an art shop near the plaza, carved by a local craftsman who understood that tools could be both functional and beautiful. Emma's eyes lit up as she examined each brush, already planning the masterpieces she would create. Will you still teach me watercolors at the new house? Of course. In fact, your parents and I have been talking about setting up regular art sessions every Saturday afternoon. Would you like that? Emma's enthusiastic nodding made all the adults smile, reminding us that family relationships could continue and even improve when built on healthier foundations. Over the next 2 weeks, Mark and Jessica moved out with a efficiency that suggested they'd put considerable thought into their transition. There were no dramatic confrontations or last-minute attempts to change my mind. Instead, they packed methodically, cleaned thoroughly, and prepared to start their new life with a maturity I hadn't seen from them before. The house felt spacious and peaceful once they were gone, like a deep breath after holding your breath for years. I spent the first week simply enjoying the silence and the freedom to move through my own space without accommodating anyone else's needs or schedule. Patricia from Austin Premier Rentals called with excellent news. She'd found ideal tenants, a professional couple relocating from California, who wanted a 6-month lease while they searched for a permanent home. The rental income would more than cover my expenses, and the short-term lease would give me flexibility to make long-term decisions about my future. 6 months later, I was sitting in my new downtown condo, watching the sunset paint the Austin skyline in shades of gold and pink. The space was smaller than my Westlake house but perfectly suited to my needs, with floor-to-ceiling windows and a balcony that overlooked Lady Bird Lake. I'd finally taken the pottery class I'd signed up for in Santa Fe, and my handmade bowls lined the kitchen shelves with imperfect beauty. Emma visited every Saturday for our art sessions, and her watercolor skills had improved dramatically. Mark had been promoted at work and Jessica's marketing job had evolved into a consulting business that kept her busy and financially stable. Our relationships had found a new equilibrium based on mutual respect rather than financial dependence. The woman who had once declared me incomplete had finally learned to stand on her own 2 feet, and the son who had forgotten how to defend his mother had rediscovered his backbone. Most importantly, I had remembered that being whole had nothing to do with other people's opinions, and everything to do with honoring your own worth. My bank account was indeed perfectly intact, but more than that, my sense of self had been restored. I was no longer someone's unpaid housekeeper or emotional support system. I was Linda Patterson, cancer survivor, successful professional, loving grandmother, and complete woman who had finally learned that the most important person to take care of was herself. Some people might call what I did selfish, but I prefer to think of it as strategic. When you stop allowing others to define your worth, you discover just how valuable you really are. And when you finally decide to prioritize your own well-being, you often find that everyone else benefits from your strength. Jessica had been right about one thing. I wasn't the same person I'd been before my cancer diagnosis. I was stronger, clearer, and absolutely unwilling to shrink myself for anyone else's comfort. If that wasn't whole, then I had no idea what wholeness actually meant. The future stretched ahead of me like an unwritten story, full of possibilities I was finally free to explore. And for the first time in years, I was excited to see what the next chapter would bring. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.